Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I offer an update on the Idaho quadruple murder, including the arrest of Bryan Christopher Kohberger? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at a brief background of the Idaho quadruple murder, take a look at the background of Bryan Christopher Kohberger, then offer my analysis. On November 13, 2022, sometime between 3 and 4 a.m., 4 college students were murdered in a rental house in Moscow, Idaho. The students, 3 women and 1 man, were stabbed to death. The police investigation which followed generated a significant amount of interest from the public and led to 19,000 tips. Some people were concerned that the police had botched the investigation from the beginning and the killer may never be caught. In the rental house, the police discovered what they believed to be the killer's DNA, and there was a white Hyundai Elantra spotted near the scene of the murders. The police tracked the Hyundai to a suspect named Bryan Christopher Kohberger and discovered that his DNA matched the DNA found at the crime scene. Law enforcement put him under surveillance at a residence in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. This is about 50 minutes south of Scranton. On December 30, 2022, at 3 a.m., a SWAT team took Bryan into custody. A white Hyundai Elantra was towed from outside the residence where he was staying. Bryan has been charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, as well as felony burglary. The police believe that Bryan acted alone. At the time making this video, Bryan is still in Pennsylvania, awaiting extradition to Idaho. His attorney said that he will waive extradition and will be denying any responsibility for the murders. Now moving to the background of Bryan Christopher Kohberger. Bryan was born on November 21, 1994, and it appears as though he was raised in Pennsylvania. In 2018, he graduated from Northampton Community College with an associate degree in psychology. In 2020, Bryan earned a bachelor's degree from DeSales University in Allentown, Pennsylvania. In 2022, he graduated with a Master of Arts in Criminal Justice from the same school. As far as employment, Bryan worked as a casual security officer for the Pleasant Valley School District from November 2018 until August 2021. A casual security officer probably refers to a part-time employee, although one could argue it's like a regular security officer, except more informal and relaxed. At the time of Bryan's arrest, he was a PhD student studying criminology at Washington State University. He lived in an apartment in Pullman, Washington, about 10 miles from Moscow, Idaho, where the murders took place. Bryan was an assistant instructor for 3 undergraduate criminal justice courses, led by the same professor. Some media outlets erroneously reported that Bryan was a doctoral candidate. Bryan had just finished his first semester not long before he was arrested. There was no way he could have been a doctoral candidate already. A doctoral student doesn't become a doctoral candidate until they finish their coursework and start their dissertation. Bryan Kohberger had no criminal history, but he did receive an infraction for not wearing a seatbelt in August of 2022. This occurred in the same county where Moscow, Idaho is located. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts in a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. A number of people who knew Bryan described him as smart, but he had trouble fitting in. Bryan was considered highly intellectual. Some people described him as a genius. He wanted people to understand that he was intelligent, like he would explain concepts in an overly complex manner. He was bullied by his classmates for being socially awkward, as well as for his weight. He was primarily bullied by girls, who would not only verbally mistreat him, but throw objects at him. Sometimes he would just walk up to girls and ask them if they wanted to hang out, even if he did not know them. Item number 2. According to one of his friends, Bryan became more aggressive as he grew older. Instead of being the target of bullying, he became a bully himself. He studied boxing and appeared to be eager to get into physical fights. Item number 3. Classmates who interacted with Bryan at Washington State University echoed the observation that he was socially awkward. He would make people uncomfortable by staring at them. He was described as super awkward, offensive, and always trying to fit in. Bryan was more animated and talkative after the murders, but he would become quiet when the class talked about the case. As I mentioned, Bryan lived in an apartment. He did not really talk to his neighbors there. Rather, he just kept to himself. Item number 4, when Bryan was a student in his master's program, he posted on social media looking for research participants. He wanted to know how emotions and psychological traits influence decision-making when committing a crime. Others said that Bryan was interested in the way the mind works. He genuinely wanted to understand what other people were thinking and feeling. Perhaps he was curious because he lacked empathy. He could not figure out what people were thinking and feeling, so he decided to take a more academic route to find out. Item number 5, how well do Bryan's characteristics, for example his personality, age, and educational level, align with the expected characteristics of the killer, like those characteristics that people thought the killer would have had before they learned who the alleged killer was? I will compare the expected characteristics to those of Bryan. It was expected that the killer was male between the ages of 20 and 40. Bryan is 28 years old, so there is a match there. The killer was supposed to be poorly educated and unemployed or underemployed. Bryan is well educated and had a job. The killer should have had a series of failed romantic relationships. It's not clear if Bryan had any romantic relationships. The killer was supposed to be impulsive, irresponsible, and have a long history of criminal behavior. Bryan does not have these characteristics. He has no criminal record at all. The expected profile had the killer as antisocial. Bryan struggled to socialize, but that is much different than being antisocial. He did not appear to be antisocial. The killer was thought to have a lack of empathy. Bryan's empathy level is not known, but it seems like he did try to connect with people. He just did not know how to do it without appearing bizarre and making people uncomfortable. The expected profile of the killer was someone who was socially awkward and considered to be a creepy loner. Bryan does appear to match these criteria. The killer was thought to have a long history of negative interactions with women. Bryan appears to meet this criterion. The expected profile indicated that the perpetrator may have an interest in law enforcement. Bryan studied criminology and was a security officer at one time. Item number 6, if Bryan was guilty, what was his motive? I think that Bryan was probably motivated through a desire to be dominant sexually, even though sex was not part of the crime. Essentially, his motive was probably the same as we see with many serial killers, even though the murder that he allegedly committed does not qualify him as a serial killer. The police have not talked about any connection that Bryan had to any of the victims, although a family member of one of the victims said there was a connection. I would be very surprised if there was no connection at all between Bryan and one of the female victims specifically. I think he was targeting one of the women in that house. Which brings me to item number 7. One hypothesis that has been thrown out in this case is the idea that Bryan was planning the perfect murder. This was not about any type of romantic desire or anything like that, rather something he carefully planned in order to be remembered forever. He wanted to become a legendary criminal. This theory is supported by the fact that Bryan was working on a PhD in criminology, like he was studying to be a perfect criminal through creating the perfect crime. Bryan also allegedly asked the police if anyone else was arrested, as if he was trying to play mind games with law enforcement. This is an interesting theory. Let's take a look at what makes a murder or murders notorious. Why do some homicides become well known? Most murders that become notorious involve several key features. The victims are young and attractive. The perpetrator is notable in that they deviate from the typical profile of a perpetrator of that type of crime. The crime is unusual, and the crime starts out as a mystery, with the details being revealed slowly over time. Based on this formula, the quadruple murder case in Idaho is consistent with a notorious crime. It checks every box. If someone was going to construct a crime with the intent of it becoming well known, it would be something like this case. With this in mind, do I think that Bryan was attempting to commit the perfect murder? No. I think that Bryan is unusual in a few ways, like he doesn't match the typical profile as well as expected, but I think what's important here is the history of not getting along with women. Which brings me to item number 8. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. From a young age, Bryan struggled to fit in. He desperately wanted to be accepted, but every time he made an effort, he was rejected brutally by his peers. He had a particular interest in becoming romantically involved with women, and he had a desire to dominate. Over time, Bryan became increasingly frustrated and more interested in violence. He started to think of violence as a solution to his problems, or perhaps something that people deserved. He wanted revenge against those who insulted him. His sense of grandiosity led him to viewing his own attitude as admirable. He believed that he could never do anything wrong. Therefore, if he was having homicidal urges, he believed it must be something positive. This led him to studying criminal justice. He wasn't studying it to bring offenders to justice, rather to honor his own view of the world. Bryan managed to hold his homicidal impulses at bay for some time, but at some point he decided that instead of being the victim, he was going to be the perpetrator. He had enough of being rejected. Bryan must have formed some type of connection to one of the victims. She may not have even known his name or that he had an interest in her. He may have simply seen her on the street or perhaps on a social media profile. Bryan somehow interpreted the woman's behavior as a rejection. On November 13, 2022, Bryan set out to get revenge. He not only wanted to kill his target, but anyone who stood in his way. He wanted to send a message to the world that he was powerful, frightening. He would no longer be bullied. He committed the murders in a haphazard fashion. It was only through luck that he was not immediately arrested. He did not effectively use his criminology background. Rather, he was acting out of rage. Bryan was hoping to get away with this crime, but is just as satisfied with being arrested. This way he can take credit for his horrific offenses. He will deny his crime and drag the proceedings out as long as possible. Item number 9. If Bryan Kohberger is guilty, how does his behavior align with other notorious killers? Bryan's profile is similar to a number of high-profile killers. A few examples. Bryan was described as socially awkward. Many notorious killers have been described that way, including Jeffrey Dahmer, Nicholas Cruz, and Timothy McVeigh. Bryan was described as highly intelligent, and he was pursuing a PhD. Ted Kaczynski was highly intelligent and had earned a PhD in mathematics. Bryan entered a structure primarily occupied by women and committed a melee attack. Ted Bundy did the same thing in 1978 at the Chi Omega sorority house in Tallahassee, Florida. Now moving to my final thoughts. Bryan Kohberger allegedly committed a crime that will become infamous. He was one of these alleged killers who raised red flags through his behavior, but not enough for people to think he was dangerous. Instead of rejecting the criminal justice system, Bryan embraced it. He learned about it. He even wanted to conduct research in this area. He was not an outsider to criminology, but he was an outsider to his peers. This is what ultimately led to his alleged homicidal behavior. That's my update on the Idaho quadruple murder case and my thoughts on Bryan Kohberger. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.